Assembly planning,
And
tall buildings.
Yes.
Have I got that right? Assembly planning, tall buildings. And now we're going to have to do a little bit of business before we get on to our main topic. And Ozu, our committee clerk, is going to take us through the business. So over to you, Ozu.
Okay, first, apologies. There are no apologies as all members are here. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the chair and members to note the list of offices held by assembly members, which is set out on item 2, and ask whether members have any other interest to declare?
Noted.
Okay. The chair has asked
here we are. I don't think this matters at all. I am a donor to the Skyline campaign, which is no doubt going to be mentioned in this, but better said than not said.
Thank you for that.
Okay. The chair has asked that items 3, 4 and 5 be taken at the same time. So if I could ask the chair and members to note the committee's membership and chairing arrangements, its terms of reference and standing delegation as set out in the agenda, and these were all agreed by the annual meeting of the Assembly on the 10th of May. Can I now ask the chair and members to agree the minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of March 2018?
Agreed.
And can I ask the chair and members to note the ongoing and completed list of actions as set out in item? And if I could ask the chair and the committee to also note recent actions taken by the chair under delegated authority. And the first item will be output arising from the discussion on the mayoral consultation on the draft London plan, which you're going to deal with under agenda item 9. And to formally note the rapporteur report, Never Again Sprinklers as a next step in fire safety, which is going to be dealt under agenda item 10. And ask the committee to also agree the topic, terms of reference and scope of the committee's first meeting of the 2018-19 Assembly year, which is being dealt with under agenda item 12. And to note the consultation response to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government's revisions to the National Planning Policy Framework, which you're dealing with under agenda item 11. And so now we come to the draft London Plan consultation response, which is agenda item 9.
We can agree that. And I want to thank Paul, who's done so much work on that.
Okay, and agenda item 10 is the rapporteur report, Never Again Sprinklers as a next step in fire safety. And can I ask the committee to formally agree the report, to note responses received, which are attached as appendices 2 and 3 of the report, and to delegate authority to Assembly Member Shah to lead on any follow-up work in relation to the recommendations in consultation with the Chair and Deputy Chair of the committee.
We can agree that. And in a moment, Navin, you want to say a word about it, don't you?
Thank you. Yes, Chair.
Yeah, we'll get there in a moment.
No problem. Thank you.
And can I ask the Chair and members to note its response to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government's consultation on revisions to the National Planning Policy Framework?
We can note that. And again, thank Paul very much for all the work he did on that.
And if I could just skip to agenda item 13, which is the Planning Committee Work Programme for 2018-19, and ask the Chair and members to note the report setting out the committee's forward work programme for the next 2 meetings and completed work, and to delegate authority to the Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chair to agree the main agenda items for the committee's meetings from November 2018 until the end of the Assembly year.
Yeah, we can note that.
And the date of the next meeting will be Wednesday, the 18th of July, 2018 at 10 a.m.
Yes.
And can I ask the Chair if there are any other urgent business to consider?
No other urgent business?
There isn't.
No.
Okay, so if we just go back now to item 10, which is the rapporteur report.
Fine.
Chair, if I can give a brief statement. Following the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower on 14th June last year, I launched a review on behalf of the Planning Committee to gather evidence of the effectiveness and economic viability of installing sprinklers in London's residential buildings. During the review, I issued a call for evidence, met with experts from the fire, construction and housing sectors, including policymakers, and this entailed, apart from the meetings, 2 roundtable discussions and undertook 4 site visits, including a couple of sites in Wales. Using strong evidence that we had, I published the report, Never Again, Sprinklers as the Next Step Towards Safer Homes. The report calls for a roadmap for a mandatory automatic fire sprinkler systems, such as sprinklers, to be required by the building regulations in all new residential buildings, as is the case in Wales, Norway, Finland and USA and other countries worldwide. And as a starting point, the recommendation asks for compulsory ASS requirements for buildings over 18 meters high, care homes and shelter housing. The report also urges the government to change the building regulations so that sprinklers are required when large buildings and care homes go through major refurbishments. To help fund sprinklers for those people most vulnerable to fire, the report calls on the Mayor to create a £50 million what we called London Sprinkler Retrofitting Fund. This is solely and urgently needed, as many councils, such as Croydon, are struggling to cover the cost of sprinkler retrofitting that will help secure the occupants from fire. I'm delighted that the London Fire Brigade, without any reservations, expressed its full support for this report. The report has received extensive coverage in national and trade media and has been used to promote fire safety, including being mentioned in the House of Commons. I was and am very disappointed that Dame Judith Hackett, in a review of building regulations and fire safety, did not ask for any changes to regulations on sprinklers. I agree with a comment that the report was a complete whitewash. Not only it failed to address issues related to flammable cladding, but it also took no account whatsoever of effectiveness of sprinklers to save lives and limit damage to properties. Nonetheless, I hope the government will make these desperately needed changes now, particularly as the London Assembly, the Mayor and the Fire Brigade are working together on a letter urging it to implement the recommendations of our report. Long enough, Chair. Additional and much needed fire safety measures have been kicked into long grass. We got to act now. I will be closely following the government's actions on this and will continue to promote the report in the media and the events to ensure its recommendations are implemented swiftly. New regulations and new funding for sprinklers, as the Fire Commissioner said, are a no-brainer, not only to protect property and reduce injuries, but to avoid further tragic loss of life. I take this opportunity to thank Planning Committee for entrusting me with this task and convey my sincere gratitude to our scrutiny team and in particular Rhys Harris for incredible support and their hard work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Navin, and thank you for all your work. Are there
Pleasure.
any other quick comments from members?
Just to say, I originally was dubious about the timing of the report, not the importance of the report. And Navin, you've been proved to be right, and I was wrong, because quite rightly, it did fill that gap that we needed. So I'm delighted to welcome the report, and I think it's going to be a good contribution in making sure that Londoners keep safe in the future.
No, I'm very proud of this work on behalf of the committee, and we will pursue to lobby the government, whatever political complexion it is, now and in the future, and indeed the Mayor and all related agencies concerned. This is something we need to do very swiftly. Thank you.
Well done.
Excellent. Well done, yes. Right, we can now go on to the item for today, and I would, just so that people know, what we're looking at today, what we're focusing on, are tall buildings and London plan policies. the committee's stance on this, and we have had other meetings on tall buildings and made a response to the Mayor's draft London plan policies on this, is that at the moment tall buildings do not meet London's housing needs. We have housing policies in the London plan and we have tall buildings policies, but we don't have tall buildings policies which relate to London's housing needs. And that's what we're going to focus on for the whole of the rest of this session. Now, I'd like our wonderful panel to introduce themselves just with one line on what you do, and then we'll start on the questioning. We'll start over there. Thank you.
So I'm David Hughes. I'm the Planning Policy Manager at Harrow Council.
I'm Shapriya Sudhakar. I lead the place shaping team at Hamlets.
Paul Wellman, Senior Analyst at EG, formerly Estates Gazette. So we provided a lot of the data and background to open up the session.
Barbara Weiss, I'm a practicing architect and I run the Skyline campaign.
My name is Sunand Prasad. I'm an architect, principal of Pinoy & Prasad Architect, and I'm also London Mayor's design advocate.
Diana Bornat from ZCD Architects, also a Mayor's design advocate, particularly interested in children and young people.
And Sunand and Diana, I'm right, aren't I, that you are both members of the, members, participants in the Mayor's, your design advocates.
Yes.
Design advocates, yes.
Advocates. Both design advocates. So it's very good that you've both joined us. Right, well if I could kick off with Paul. Now, one of the catalysts for this meeting is that New London Architecture recently produced its annual survey showing that there were now 500 tall buildings in the pipeline, and that means under construction, having planning permission but not yet started, in the planning process, or coming to the planning process and proposals. Now, apparently it's Paul who is the data king behind all this, so we're very pleased you've joined us, and you are the one that feeds the research and data that underpins the annual survey, is that correct?
Yeah, correct.
Right. Well, can I kick off by saying, you above all then will know, and you'll have to give us, flesh out the details, but we are very aware that the number of tall buildings has, escalated enormously, not sure exactly by how much over recent years,
Sure.
and enormously in the last 10. Can you put some flesh on the bones of that statement?
Yeah, absolutely. So as of last year, so year end 2017, we had 510 towers in the pipeline. That was up from 455 the previous year. So 18 towers completed last year and 55 in the past year. So obviously the number's gone up, but that doesn't include completions, like you said, and some new towers would have superseded other towers in the pipeline. Around 90% of that pipeline of 510 towers are for the residential market. We've got 267 at permission, 70 applications, and another 57 at EIA stage. So we would imagine that this year, 2018, again will be a fairly healthy year with so many applications already at EIA. We'd imagine they would come through the system and be applications this year.
So when you say in with 510,000 in the pipeline, is that planning? Is that applications, permission, starts?
No, yeah. So that's applications, under constructions, permissions, and EIA. So environmental impact assessments.
Yeah. Thank you.
EIA means that
EIAs are for large applications.
Where they're coming forward.
Yes, exactly. It's where a developer puts forward their proposal, but in very brief, just to give an indication to the council that something's coming forward. And if we have a look at the sort of application rates, it was fairly level around 2004 to 2009. Bit of a jump 2000. I think you've got the graphs in front of you where you can see. The last 5 years, actually, there's a little bit of a caveat at 2015. 2015 was an exceptional year for applications, nearly up to 120. However, there was an exceptional application within that year, being Greenwich Peninsula. I think that nearly had around 40 towers within that single application. If you take that out of the figures, the last 5 years have actually been quite flat line. So there's a real jump from 2012 and then 13 onwards has been quite remarkable. What that, we can probably talk about why that was. London Olympics, London was on a global stage. We had a lot of international capital looking to get into London property there on in. On starts have obviously gone up dramatically in recent years. They did tail off last year, however. Brexit, stamp duty, whatever. There's probably a multitude of factors there. Stuff still is coming out of the ground, and increasingly for the build-to-rent market. I'm sure we'll definitely touch on that.
We'll move on to questions about that, yes.
Yeah, sure. And another really sort of key trend that we're seeing is that towers are being increasingly proposed out into the suburbs, out into those sort of zones 3, 4 and 5 and outer London. Back in 2011, just 7% of towers were proposed in zones 3, 4 and 5. Last year, that was up to 72%. So it's a real dramatic shift there.
Into zones?
Into zones 3, 4 and 5.
72%?
Yeah.
Last year, by the way, I've analysed the Mayor's over 10 stories. How many? I think there were just over, sort of around about 35, 36 permissions given.
Right.
Over 10 stories.
Over 10 stories.
And the majority of those were between 10 and 20 stories.
Right. Across outer London?
Hmm?
Across outer London?
No. This is across all London.
Those figures seem small.
I'm interested to know if you think they're small. This is what we've got from the database.
Oh, from the
permissions
LDD
given
database.
by the Mayor during 2017.
Okay, yeah. Well, we track everything from 5 units and above in London, 10 units and above in outer London. We then go and site visit every single site with permission or under construction to get those figures across the whole of London. So we've got, and the database goes back 20 years. It's a big comparable database for developers, investors, agents, whoever wants to sort of know key insights and trends into the market. And we go out and get that data, as opposed to, I think, the LDD database, which is where councils have to give sort of the data ad hoc, I think. So it may be a bit more up to date, I don't know.
Yes. I'd be interested actually to compare. This is 2017, the actual calendar year. Those are the...
Okay, ours is...
I want to check that with you then.
Yeah, we can...
We don't want different... We don't
Sure.
want the Mayor having
Yeah,
one set of data and you having another. So let's look at that after the meeting. We could just compare that. But your definition, the New London Architecture definition of tall buildings, is over 20 stories.
It is 20
Whereas
stories.
the Mayor's, and that's the national definition too, isn't it?
Is it?
But the Mayor's definition is over 10 stories.
Right.
And the London Plan is about to give responsibility for defining what is a tall building to local authorities, and we'll get onto that in a moment. So, just to pick up on one bit before I pass on the questioning, you mentioned overseas investment. How much, we're really interested in why is this phenomenon happening? How much of it is due to overseas investment?
I think towers, on the whole, were always speculative in that developers would need to sell sort of a third of the scheme in order to go to the bank to get financing. Overseas investors are more likely to buy off plan. With that sort of international flood of capital, that tap has been not turned off, but it has slowed in more recent years. And at the same time, we've seen house prices go through the roof, and we're now seeing the emergence of the build-to-rent market. So there is that turn. So whether that was everything that was the reason behind 2012, probably not. There was obviously an evolution of the London Plan policy around tall buildings. And I'll just read those out, actually, if I may. The 2008 London Plan said tall buildings and create attractive landmarks and provide a coherent location for economic clusters. That moved on to the 2016 plan, which indicated tall buildings should generally be limited to the central activity zone, opportunity areas, town centres or locations with good transport access, so good PTAL ratings. However, the new 2017 draft London plan, it goes more explicit, saying tall buildings have a role in London, accommodating expected growth. So then you can really see that progression in the London plan. You've got to sort of ask, why have progressive mayors done that? I think London's population grew by a million people over the last 10 years, so 100,000 people added to London's population. At the same time, I think, looking at our data, in completions, around 20,000 houses completed on average over the last decade. So you've got 20,000 homes, 100,000 people. You've got London constrained by Greenbelt, you've got viewing corridors, conservation areas, and in the new draft London plan, they said there's going to be a no net loss of industrial areas. So
industrial premises.
Yeah, no net loss of industrial space. I mean, you can intensify.
We don't mean no net loss of land.
Yeah, industrial land. Yeah.
They're not saying that. They're saying no net loss of premises. They will lose land.
Okay. But I guess if you add all of those up, Greenbelt, we are going to get more tall buildings.
That's your view. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
That's your view. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think you can.
Can I ask you another question?
Go on.
You strategic policy. How much? Well, you've probably answered it, haven't you? In your view, the role of strategic policy has been to open up.
Absolutely. If you look at one good example is the Old Kent Road, and you see that new sort of opportunity at the Old Kent Road, and you see the amount of applications now coming through. It seems to have a ceiling of 48 stories, believe it or not. There's 3 applications, recent applications over the last 6 months, that will be in next year's report, all with tall buildings up to 48 stories. So you've only got to see what that opportunity area has done to that area.
One of the things we need to explore a bit later on, and then I'll leave the questioning on this issue, but just for the panel, is how far. I've noticed by looking at the Mayor's applications for last year that often the site will be quite large and the tall building will be one element of the site. And I don't know the Old Kent Road applications, but are they on smaller sites and therefore they're having to go up as high as that?
They are sort of big box, what we might call big box retail. So they are not just a tall building, they are a tall building with other elements that sort of create I think they're all sort of over 1,000 homes, these schemes, whereas the tall building might only be 200 or 300 homes. I think that's probably a key point that you've touched on actually. Like, tall buildings may not always be for family housing, but where a developer has a tall building within a larger scheme, that may create sort of 1 and 2 beds, but then the family housing is in lower rise buildings next door.
Is that true of the Old Kent Road applications?
I can't, not off the top of my head, I can't be definitive.
I think the size of the plot in relation to the height is really interesting for us and how that's used, because the Mayor has actually made a statement that he's interested in a more nuanced approach, quote, he wants more different configurations for high densities. High rise does not, these are all quotes from the Mayor, high rise does not mean high density. But we know that the top of the last density matrix was 350 units per hectare. You've just cited 1,000 units. I don't know if it was per hectare.
No, 1,000 units within the entire scheme.
1,000 units per hectare is super density. 350 is just about as high as you can go and build, decent homes at about perimeter box, 10 stories, 11 stories. But anyway, but we know that 50% of schemes were above that 350.
Yeah, the density matrix was often breached, very often.
Well, 50% were above it, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, Paul, thank you very much for that introduction.
No worries.
We'll come back if we need any.
Can I just ask a supplementary to one of your replies? You said that often the family housing is in other properties as a part of a scheme. Why is it in other properties rather than in the town?
That's a good question.
Coming on to that. Yeah, I know, but it was followed on.
Yeah, I guess the developers probably, it might be easier to configure 1 and 2 beds within a sort of a core with a tower, as opposed to it being sort of in 3-4-story townhouses. Yeah.
We're going to explore this
in
much more detail a bit later on.
I'll chip in when I can.
Okay. So it's Tony now.
To answer Andrew's questions, the developer said to me yesterday he can't sell larger properties on the whole. That's what they believe anyway. Thank you for this. This is really helpful. Have you got a map of the boroughs that would give us a breakdown in terms of where they are, where the applications are? Not now, but afterwards. That would be really helpful.
I think there is a sort of a graph as opposed to in here.
Yeah. But just a detailed borough by borough would be really kind of map would be really good. My question though is, which you've probably got in front of you, is why are more than 90% of these tall buildings now resi and increasingly build to rent or PRS in nature, please?
I think sort of tall buildings have always been for the residential market. We're seeing a lot more student housing and sort of co-living is even sort of creeping into the mix a bit. But like I said earlier, we all know house prices are very high, and therefore developers are looking at build to rent. At the same time, there's sort of institutional money looking to get into property with that sort of steady long-term income stream. And towers really work for build to rent. The sort of economies of scale, where you have that on-site management, on-site concierge, and sort of creating that community vertically. So when when international money was coming overseas, that was very often for buy-to-let. So these properties would have been let out, being rented. So it's almost just missing the middleman, if that makes sense. So instead of having a multitude of owners letting out their properties, we have like a single ownership across the entire building. And that way you can create amenity space. And a lot of build-to-rent developers probably wouldn't go anywhere near sites that are less than 200 units because they need that economies of scale. And so when you can go up and create a tower, you get that. So we are seeing a real increase in build-to-rent. I think there was a slight error actually here. I should probably just... it said there was 30% of applications last year were for build-to-rent. That was actually starts. So 30% of starts last year were for the build-to-rent market. And that will, you can see that up from virtually nothing just a few years ago, and probably will increase a bit further too.
Can I just go into build-to-rent encourage more of a mix in terms of size of units, like family, 3-4 bed, as well as 1 and 2 bed, or not?
Quite possibly. There's a really good example actually over in Greenwich, Creekside Wharf. It's not even yet quite complete.
It's modular.
It is modular. It is, yeah. It's essential living, and it actually won a Housing Design Award in 2016. And I've just got it in front of me actually. The panel praised the building, saying the real changes are to be found inside the scheme. Those are the first apartments to be designed with families as their target market. So I think they had sort of wider corridors, wider doors, storage for buggies, those little things really. So I think it can be done. Whether it's that's probably the exception as opposed to the rule.
How tall? How tall was it?
How tall? It's tough. Go on.
Yeah, I think
I think it's 23 stories.
Just finishing, and I'll let Tom come in terms of the trends going future. You mentioned particularly the scheme in Greenwich, which had a lot of towers in it. So, I mean, there was also a view that certainly in the industry, that a lot of these towers would never be built, because there isn't enough capital to actually to get a return on them, and there isn't enough building companies, frankly, with the skill sets to build them with the shortage of skilled labour in the London market. So do you believe, in terms of the trends going forward, do you believe that these numbers are going to, you said go up? I have to say, I don't believe that personally. Do you really believe they are going to go up both as a percentage, as a total in terms of the mix?
For build-to-rent schemes?
Yes, not just build-to-rent, but all towers.
All towers. I mean, there are a lot of schemes where there are multiple towers. So, Greenwich Peninsula, Brent Cross, these are schemes that will take many, many years, probably a couple of economic cycles. Those towers that were originally envisaged for sale, some of them may likely flip for the rental market. We've already seen that, where I think Borough have sold a couple of towers or forward funding deals to the likes of Greystar. So that more of that might happen. But you're right, there's definitely a construction skills crisis and sort of the viability issue. Where does it actually stack up? We're seeing more modular construction in towers. Down in Croydon, there's a 44-storey modular tower under construction at the moment, which will be the world's tallest. The same company completed last year in Wembley at Apex House, which is now Europe's tallest modular tower at 29 stories.
In terms of density, how's this going to affect housing density overall, do you think?
Overall, I mean, it's hard to kind of look at it as an overall picture. It's really a site-by-site basis.
Can you give us a figure in terms of borough by borough or central versus outer? Not now, but it'd be interesting to get your view of where the trends are going.
It's hard to sort of put a number on it. I mean, I know that the mayor's looking at getting rid of the density matrix and sort of having a design-led how that works out. That's remains to be seen. But I don't think we're going to get all of a sudden much taller towers. I think there are clusters where there are taller towers, Canary Wharf and Vauxhall, etc. And as you go out into the suburbs, they aren't quite as tall. Okay.
I'll leave it there. Thank you, Tom.
Before that, can I just ask if any other members want to come in on anything that's been questioned so far? Any other members of the panel?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Are you able to segment, since you visited every site, the size of each plot and the tall buildings? So, to answer this question about whether smaller plots are driving taller buildings, I think it would be really good to know what the evidence base is for that. Because I mean, a fundamental fact is that land price per unit is a key part of any viability assessment, obviously. And the more you can put vertically in a building, the lower the land cost per unit. So there's a no-brainer thing here about driving, commercially driving that, which is only one of many market and also government fiscal policy forces that drive upwards. Another one is 106s. For example, if all the infrastructure and 106 costs are to be picked up by the developer, it would tend to drive tallness. We found that in the mayoral work last year. So I think there are a number of, I think one of the questions is why are we getting all these tall buildings? It is partly the planning context and the encouraging signs made by the mayors. And I was thinking actually your own database, to which a lot of developers must go to try to assess the chances of whether they'll get permission in this or that place is probably in the mix as well, where you as an experimenter are affecting the experiment and actually driving some of the results. There are a lot of things coming together to drive this upwards, but we'll say more about that in a minute.
Does anyone else want to come in on any of the points?
I'm curious to know what the statistics are on the amount of affordable that has been generated in the last 4 years since we've started seeing.
I think we do have some figures on the sort of the mix between private and affordable. Obviously, they are more for the private market. Like I said earlier, the tower element would usually have the private housing, and then a smaller building sort of next door by the same developer would normally house the affordable units.
Yes, but how much would a single development generate? So if you add up all the affordable that's been generated in the last few years, what is the
I don't have those figures in front of me.
Because the feeling is that it's very
but
low.
I think it's it's more sort of 15% as opposed to 35.
How much? 15?
Within the towers specifically.
In the tower specifically.
But I would need to clarify that.
Could we have that?
Yeah. Well, I can go back.
I think that's very, very important
Yeah.
because from our perspective, obviously these towers are creating untold damage on London as a whole. So if in the end we're not generating affordable housing, is it really worth doing? So
I think overall they probably are, but not within the tower element itself.
Okay, I think we need more statistics. And I think that's a very important figure there.
I looked at the permissions the Mayor gave last year, 2017, and I just looked, though, between 10 stories, remember, tall buildings start at 10 for the Mayor, between 10 and 20, which is the highest number of permissions he gave, 7% were social rented. And I think it was 11% that were generally termed something else, like intermediate or
so
London living rent. And it wasn't, and in the 7% you weren't clear. Actually, I don't think it was clear it was social rent. It was just affordable rent.
So I would like to comment that I don't think towers on the whole are the best place for families to live. I know that in cities like New York, everybody lives in towers, and that's part of New York's DNA. But in London, it is not part of the city's DNA to have small children high up in the sky off lifts. So
Barbara, we're coming on to these issues.
Okay. Yes.
Can I come? Because I wanted to come into just a specific thing on the essential living development, and you said it won a design award and it was designed so for families. But do we know if families ended up actually living in it?
It's not yet complete.
Oh, it's not yet complete.
No, it's already won.
Well, that's probably why I could only find CGI images of it on Google. Then
I think.
Oh, right. Well, we'll wait and see.
Yeah,
Because I think often, particularly with the build to rent sector, even when it's built, Creekside Wharf. Even if it's built for sort of family sized, you end up with flat sharers in it anyway because it's expensive.
Yeah.
Dinah, you wanted to come in?
I've got a question about the planning process. Can you get any evidence on whether the towers tend to grow during planning because the viability is shifting? Because I sense that that's what I'm seeing in design review panels, is that they've had to push up the tower to get more capacity on the site, and that the other elements tend to have a kind of limit, if you like, because of their sort of urban design principles. So whether that's pushing the towers significantly higher.
It's a good point, actually. Anecdotally, yeah, it does, absolutely, that does happen. Not to all, obviously, but to some it definitely does. And I think one of the, I spent like down in Croydon actually a couple of weeks ago, the planning committee almost said, yeah, go a little bit higher and we can get the affordable.
Yeah.
So I think the developer is quite happy to do that, get their scheme to 35%, try and get that fast track scheme through and get a few extra floors. And sometimes even when they get permission, and then a couple of years go back again and try again for slightly higher.
We've also heard, but we haven't got the evidence, that what's given permission is then not always, especially in terms of affordable housing, it doesn't turn out quite like that. So we haven't really scrutinised the implementation after they're implemented. Do you do any of that, Paul?
We probably no. That's not something we would. In terms of tenure, and in terms of mix, except like in terms of tenure.
In terms of tenure.
Yeah, I think.
Changes.
So yeah,
between the permission.
So sort of minor material amendments or Section 73 applications. Yeah, we would pick up those. We would, but we haven't sort of done any analysis on that. Something we probably could, but may take a while.
It's worth doing, I think. Tom, you want to come?
I was just wondering, like something you said earlier, why? Because I think we're using the definition of more than 20 stories as a tall building, but the Mayor's using a definition of more than 10. Why aren't we using the same definition as the Mayor?
Why isn't the Mayor using the same definition?
Why isn't the Mayor using the same definition?
Why are they using?
Y20.
Yeah.
I think that's the NLA. Was it 4 years ago now? Just took that's what they class a tall building as. And we've done the data for them. It's also probably worth pointing out that a 20-storey office building is not the same height as a 20-storey residential building. Sort of floor-to-ceiling heights in an office building will probably be about 5 metres. In a residential building, it's probably more like 3.2, 3.3. So a 30-storey residential building might be the same as a 20-storey office building. Just one thing to add to the mix.
It's really interesting.
Maybe we should be using meters rather than stories then.
Possibly.
Or maybe the Mayor should be using meters rather than stories to define.
The Mayor uses meters for calling in as well.
Calling in, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Sorry, I wanted to make a comment. Paul, you said that towers tended to be residential, but I've had this conversation with Nikki on many occasions that are up to quite recently, all the towers were commercial. And it's only in the last few years that there's been this sudden change. I think it was very much encouraged by the Mayor and by the fact that it was bringing in so much foreign capital.
Yeah.
But there isn't a tradition of private towers, private flats. There were, I think, council estates with towers that have not been very popular, and a lot of those buildings have been demolished or are going through a very difficult stage of their lives. So I think we are in uncharted territory with these private towers, with a lot of consequences, because we don't know how the upkeep of these towers is going to pan out in the future. And we know that towers are very, very expensive to maintain and look after. So there could be problems with them becoming, as we say, the slums of the future if they're not looked after properly.
Just to counter that the build-to-rent market, where these institutions will hold the stock for years and years and years to come, they certainly will look after their buildings.
I think that's very good news.
Yeah.
I think it's very good news that we've got one owner coming back into being responsible, rather than blocks being divided into hundreds of different small owners who'll never want to demolish the building when it's at the end of its life, and they're not being built for very great longevity. So that's a concern.
I was reading a fascinating piece in New York about the trouble they have, or the issues around demolishing tall buildings, particularly these particular office buildings that have reached the end of their natural life. It's quite interesting. But anyway, sorry, I won't go into that.
Well, yes, their sustainability is quite an issue.
Years,
yes, the average life span.
The what? The average is
41 years.
41 years. Yeah.
That's for commercial buildings.
Commercial buildings.
Right. Shall we move on now?
Yes, I've got a couple of questions on aspects in terms of how the boroughs approach high-rise tower blocks, etc. And I'm particularly pleased that we got two professional officers representing both inner London and outer London boroughs. And I know for sure that certainly in Harrow, which is my patch, there's strong resistance from local residents on anything which is high-rise. And got two clear examples, I think both in opportunity areas. One was the Dandara scheme, which is the old post office tower, post office site by Harrow station, where the permission was granted for, I think, what is 20-story block, the highest block?
Yeah, it was an appeal originally.
Yeah, and that was granted on appeal. And the recent one last year, one of the two called in by the Maher, which was on Palmerston Road, again, a lot of resistance for those blocks. So that is something I'd like to bear in mind when you respond to the questions as to what is the local sort of attitude, local residents to tower blocks. Also, what is going to be, if you don't already have definition of high-rise in terms of number of stories, and also capacity issue in terms of departments or councils' sort of role as planning authority, whether, both in the new as well as old sort of London plan regime, whether there is that level of expertise in terms of assessing, defining and so on, tall buildings where when you get applications. So with that kind of introduction, if I can go into the questions, the first one is how is your borough approaching the issue of managing applications for tall residential towers? You can start with Sri.
Great. Thank you very much for having me here. And so, as you probably know, Tower Hamlets has
Sri, could you, for the webcast, could you just
speak up a bit?
Yeah, really, you have to. Sorry.
Tower Hamlets has highest number of planning applications coming the borough in London, and also for quite high-rise buildings, as you would know from the information that Paul presented. So the way we are currently managing, as we've managed in the last few years, is through the planning process, where firstly setting out clear direction of where they're acceptable, that is identifying the locations. So the current local plan was adopted in 2010. It identified Aldgate and Canary Wharf as the primary location for tall buildings, but it also recognized that the approach we would take is a town centre hierarchy. So higher up in the town centre hierarchy, for example, like Canary Wharf, which is
high-rise where?
Higher up in the hierarchy of the town centres, the higher there's potential to grow. That directly relates to also the PTAL levels and access to public transport in the town centres. What we have seen over the years, and Paul kind of also mentioned this, the shift from office, commercial tall buildings to them becoming more residential. So a particular case is Aldgate. The borough prepared a master plan for Aldgate in 2007. At that time, the whole area of Aldgate was very much about commercial office buildings, addressing its proximity to the city fringe. Now, in 2017, we're seeing that that's actually a very sought-out residential location, with towers going up in Goodman's Field and also Aldgate Place. So that has been a big shift, which we're seeing. So we also manage the applications through the development management process. So we have a very strong pre-application process. And one of the things you mentioned, Naveen, is about having resource. So we have a range of expertise in the council, from planning officers, urban design officers, architects, and conservation officers in the team, who actually encourage developers to work closely with the officers to actually achieve a better outcome. We also have a design review process, and one of the oldest and longest running design review panel is in Tower Hamlets, where we have 17 panel members, ranging from architects, landscape architects to conservationists, where we take larger schemes for design review at pre-application stage. Through the pre-application process, we really scrutinize these schemes to not only look at the appropriateness in terms of where they're located, but also the impacts. So every scheme at pre-app stage, we would do the EIA scoping, but also look at how they meet, like sunlight, daylight, the quality of those schemes, how the different uses accommodated within them, are actually designed to the best possible outcome they can. Now, this framework only works where we are looking at applications on an individual site. Let's say a tall building as part of a much lower rise scenario, or where they're part of this cluster. But what we started to experience from 2014 onwards is huge number of these applications coming together in a very small area. For example, south of Canary Wharf, which is the opportunity area of Isle of Dogs. We found it very difficult to manage that level of intensity and interest in a very small site. And one of the things, as you mentioned earlier, is the challenge of decoupling high-rise, high-density at the same time, and especially looking at residential-led scheme, because the tall building cluster, which is predominantly office, has a completely different requirement of the site and also the surrounding compared to a residential. So we found ourselves in a really challenging position. Also, in the absence of an opportunity area planning framework work being done, because that time the GLA were still undertaking the work. So we had to come up with something in the interim to manage this level of growth. And that is when we came up with the master plan for South Quay area. That essentially had 22 hectares of land with 30 different landowners. Almost 70% of that land area had some form of development activity, whether it was pre-app or an application. And we came up with a set of principles of how the sites can come forward and how they can work together with the neighboring site owner to deliver something that is holistic and which can actually lead to a neighborhood-based approach rather than it being each site doing it on its own. So to just give you an example, one site, Key House, was 0.19 hectare, a very small site. That was, they came in for a planning application for 68 stories and 500 units on a very small site, all stacked vertically, and that was significant overdevelopment. So we had to refuse the scheme, but then that kind of sets one of the responses, like you were asking earlier about, is it the small sites that are actually driving up, or is it a part of the larger site? Definitely in our experience in South Quay, it is the smaller sites trying to come, a lot of activity in clearly rising very tall. That also kind of correlates to the 2012 housing SPG, which talked about optimizing housing numbers, which almost all developers saw as a way forward for delivering housing. So even though the London plan density matrix of 1,100 have rooms per hectare were the highest, we were seeing in densities up to 5 times, 6 times that level. And in the whole planning process, it's all about managing, balancing various aspects and getting public benefits. And Tower Hamlets having the highest housing target up to now, we've often had to have a pragmatic approach. And what we found also is the impact assessment-based approach wasn't necessarily delivering good placemaking. And that challenge continues to operate in the borough. And given that we have over 30,000 new homes to be planned in the opportunity area, that remains a key issue. So we are managing through the planning framework that we have, but we're also finding that it's quite limited when we come to residential-led tall buildings, and particularly in opportunity areas where their cumulative impacts are hard to mitigate.
I've got a few points. Do you have definition of tall buildings? One, how much of that, in terms of residential and commercial tall buildings, do you have kind of numbers or proportion of how many residential and how many commercial? What level of affordable units that you get in those, and also the quantum of family-sized dwellings, and both attitude of the local residents, how you engage, and how do you deal with social infrastructure aspects when you get large schemes like these? Please, thank you.
Okay, so our definition has also evolved, and our current definition as part of the new local plan is really twice the surrounding or prevailing building heights. So we have in the borough places which are predominantly just 2-story residential or conservation areas. So we can't really adopt this 10-story asset because there are considerable impacts. So the approach we've taken is to do based on the prevailing building heights. What may be tall building in one location may not be in others. So that's kind of our working definition. But of course, anything over 10 stories that is referable to the mayor remains one of the definitions as well. So I don't have the figures in terms of how much of the proportion between residential and commercial. Our commercial tower applications would tend to be mostly around Canary Wharf and perhaps in Aldgate. And they, from my experience, they are considerably lower. The percentage of residential towers is considerably higher in the borough because most of the workspace is also changing. They're not necessarily all in purpose-built tall buildings, but essentially smaller workspaces are also being expanded. Does that answer?
Affordable.
Affordable, yes. So affordable, the policy is to seek between 35 to 50%. Over the last 5 years, we've been able to secure a sizable chunk of that, including even in tall buildings. So if you want the affordable proportion of how much we've been able to secure in taller residential buildings, it's so for example, I don't have the percentage for the whole borough in terms of year statistics, but I can give you examples in some instances. So South Quay Plaza, which is a scheme quite in this very...
Sorry, what are you saying? Say it louder, please.
Okay.
South Quay's master plan?
So South Quay Plaza is one of the taller residential tower scheme.
Yeah.
We have been able to secure 35% of affordable housing in the scheme. Meridian Gate is another scheme in South Quay area.
Can we ask about that affordable housing? Is it what sort of what sort of mix? Is it 1 bed, 2 bed?
It's we have a policy of at least 45% of them being family homes, so 3 bed plus. So there would be a range of 2 bed, 1 bed, 3 bed, but the percentage of family homes would be around at least 45%. So it has quite a large size of number of family homes. 45%.
Even in tower blocks?
Yes.
Sorry,
so our approach is
45% affordable overall.
35% affordable overall.
35% affordable.
And 45% of that
family
size
would
be family size.
45% of the 35.
In the tower.
Yes.
Itself, not an ancillary development.
No, not off-site or...
So we have seen different models in the South Quay area. Some where they've been able to demonstrate that inappropriateness of doing that within a tower, so we've been able to secure off-site. In others, we have been able to secure it on-site.
So what's demonstrated the inappropriateness?
So where the sites are very small and where they're not able to accommodate it because of the cores. So you need a separate core for affordable and a separate core for private. And the site is very small to accommodate all the amenity that comes with it. So that's where they have been able to secure an off-site provision.
Can I just say, I think other members of the panel might want to come in and ask questions, not just us. Yeah. Especially if you have more understanding of cause.
I'd love to ask a question.
If I can just finish off my last bit, which remains unexplored, and then and that is, obviously you mentioned amenity. When you have a large proportion, like 45% of family-sized dwellings in a block, when you have small sites where you can't have your active or recreational or passive sort of recreational spaces, etc., how do you deal with that? And also, large neighborhoods, which is what we're creating with tower blocks. How do you deal with other aspects in terms of, there's sill and everything, but it's not quite sufficient in my view. How do you deal with social infrastructure provision as well?
Within South Quay Master Plan itself, the sites are all different in the way they've addressed this issue of family homes and how do you deal with the amenity requirements that come with it. So child play space is a significant part of that because affordable homes and family-sized homes means there is a clear requirement. So one example is Mill Harbour Village, which is also another big scheme within South Quay. Does this by having them on ground level, but also having a podium level. So the master plan for South Quay really encouraged people to look at a podium and a tower-based approach, which meant that the lower 6 to 8 story of the block can actually accommodate larger size family units, and then the level above that, which could be used as an open space for the community and for the residents and can accommodate play space. In some cases, we have also kind of explored the option of having internal play areas. So it could be at different levels. It may be that a dedicated floor is given for just play space, but that only works for older children. But our thrust has been 0 to 5-year-old is really external open play. So that's kind of what we have.
And just confirm, therefore, that the children, if they're playing in a play space, they will be above their properties, tend to be above. How does that help for parental supervision?
So,
have you considered that?
With these schemes, there are a range of options. 0 to 5-year-old children, the push has been very much about on the ground, being able to access maybe next to the core, which is open space. The ones on the podium levels, it is not directly overlooked by the properties, because obviously in some levels they are lower, but the kind of approach is that it has a direct access from the core, and there would be supervision because the parents would be with the children at that level. And they would be overlooked by other residential elements at the higher level.
Can I ask you, do you have a limit as to up to what level of high-rise building you would accommodate family-sized dwellings, or they can be very high up?
So
have you got a limit?
With the private, it's difficult because it's about choice, and often you see that large-size family homes choose to go for the penthouses, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But with affordable family homes, our approach is to kind of really limit it to 6 to 8. But we don't have a policy to say you have to stop doing that after 6 stories. But most of the registered providers who work with the applicants, there is a wider understanding that that is the model. So the lower stories are the ones that's given over to families.
Okay, thank you.
6 stories?
6 to 8 stories is what we see.
6 to 8.
But there's nothing to actually say beyond 8 you cannot.
Sunan, you wanted to?
In fact, you've started on the same line already. So, but if I can just take that a little bit further, you mentioned quality of placemaking, but there's actually also the creation of a community that has a good chance of becoming a diverse and cohesive community. It has diversity of families, but also of abilities, ages, and all the other diversities we know about. How much attention do you pay to the idea that this piece of development must also, at some point in the near future, create a community that really works, which isn't full of it's not alienated, it's not great kind of blocks which are not together with each other, and how do you think it's possible to have small sites with tall buildings where that could be made to happen? I mean, I can imagine. I must start by saying I don't think if you have a decent size or the right size site, of course you can make a fantastic place which has tall buildings as well as lower buildings and amenities and so on. Kidbrooke is one example of where it's been tried at a larger scale. But in places like Wood Wharf and other parts of Isle of Dogs, where you're getting densities of over 1,000 dwellings a hectare on small sites, how can you not only create a good design, you can have clever things like podiums with internal play spaces, which in theory have all the right amenities. But can you really, hand on heart, say, this is a great place to live?
I share really the question and what's behind the question as well. We find that really challenging, but at the same time, given the level of activity, we have to come up with something that we can help to inform the process. So firstly, where they are part of an existing or established community and a new tower building comes in, they generate a certain set of issues which that building or the design of that has to address in terms of what does it do to the wider public, what does it contribute. So there is that part of it. Where we are looking at new areas like South Quay, which was predominantly old office blocks where there aren't that many of residents who live there. So it's a formation of a new community in the way we attempt. And if, as you say, if there are large sites, you can actually create a lot more of placemaking and possibility for a community to come together through those places. With the smaller sites, it's much harder. So what we try to do through the master plan is look at those ingredients that could bring people together or help establish a way for the different schemes to relate. So for example, what I mean by that is a focus on the community infrastructure, the social infrastructure, and how you accommodate that within the master plan. And how do you encourage different landowners to actually have that as a core? Because it's in their interest to create.
I mean, that's absolutely right. That's the job of the local authority, to effectively turn these small sites into a larger site. You know, i.e. aggregation of small sites. Your job is to coordinate the whole, because not everybody can have a large site. But one implication of that is there may be a whole plot which is owned by a landowner which needs to be a park.
Yes.
In your master plan.
Yes.
And yet somebody's paid a lot of money to buy it in anticipation, having read State's Gazette and having done all their homework, that they're likely to get a permission on this plot for a building like that. They've paid that money and they're living by that. I mean, they are scared to not build those buildings, and they're doing everything they can to get that planning permission. So it's a very difficult situation. And to be blunt, are we saying that the numbers that are being sought are compromising the quality of life that we're creating? Is it? I mean, if you say that, then at least it's clear.
I think it is a reality for us, especially in some of the opportunity areas within the borough. And this is the kind of thing that drove us to actually look at South Quay Master Plan as an interim, because the OAPF now published and is for consultation. That clearly sets out the requirement for the area. So for example, we know the number of primary schools we have to provide, the number of secondary schools we have to provide within the borough. All of them are not in blank open land. They're all part of established places. So somewhere they have to kind of accommodate for that. What we have been able to secure in some of these schemes is, for example, the Meridian Gate example I mentioned. Site that's large enough, but we allocated that as part of the master plan as a location for a public park because the area lacked open space. That meant that the scheme had a small size of footprint that it could develop, which resulted in it going quite tall. So the balance is, what is the scheme enabling? But then we are clearly pushing up numbers and density on particular sites because of those infrastructure needs.
Tom, you want to come?
It sounds like one of the things that's needed is there's greater land assembly powers for councils and indeed for the mayor if you want to deal with this issue.
Yes. I just wanted to kind of come to that point because the new OAPF for the Isle of Dogs essentially says as part of its monitoring that applicants should come together and prepare a master plan and then illustrate how their particular scheme relates or contributes to that as part of the planning application process. Now, at the moment, it's only advisory. But I think for us, what would be great is how do we make it actually mandatory? Because all of those schemes will be referable to the mayor. So if there is a way, and that is something that we would request your support on, that there is at least a consortium of 3 or 4 developers having to come together and demonstrate a shared vision, because we find it hard to do that through PRIA, because often these are confidential information. We can't share with the next door neighbours. We can only encourage them to do it.
Is this something that GLA can, given their strategic
Yes, because the opportunity areas are designated areas from the London plan. And if there is a way that we can say all applications in the opportunity areas should come forward with a joined up approach with neighbouring sites. And when they make the application to the borough, which is GLA referable, this information is part of it, and that way there is a lot more onus on them to contribute and collaborate.
Can I just say this is coming perilously close to what the Skyline campaign is saying, is that you shouldn't have a tower block without a master plan.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
That's what we've said.
Yes, and what we've said as well. So you're basically you're preaching to the choir here, which is great.
Diana, you wanted to?
I was kind of to continue this conversation about the kind of social capital I think you were talking about. I noticed that the Green Book now has the Treasury's Green Book has an emphasis on has always had an emphasis on sustainability, as in also in the National Planning Policy Framework. But the social return on the investment now is a potentially measurable requirement. Now, some of the work that I'm doing, and I think it's really pertinent to housing and communities and neighbourhoods, would suggest that local authorities and landowners could be baselining their inherent social value of existing estates and neighbourhoods, so that any future development works on an improvement on that and an understanding of what that value is. And my particular area, as you know, is about children and young people, and who in housing terms are hugely important to understand and don't behave like adults. I'm a bit worried about 0 to 5-year-olds being categorised as a group in their own, because they usually have older brothers and sisters who they need to play with, and they do play with, and they are sent outside to play with. So it's really a much more cohesive neighbourhood is a neighbourhood which is safe for all children to play out of any age, and that those vertical relationships are going to kind of help knit the community together, rather than the kind of supervision of 0 to 5-year-olds being the kind of driver, from what I understand. But I think that we could look at putting towers on new sites in terms of what their contribution will make, and shouldn't have a negative contribution to the inherent social value. But we need to agree some measurements for those things. And I think some questions could kind of come out of boroughs starting to have this conversation, and the GLA could form a kind of a sounding board or an opportunity for getting boroughs together to have this conversation about what is the social value that we're looking for. Is it about how many neighbours do I know? How many would I feel safe going round to if I was in, that those things are quite easy to measure, aren't they? And quantify. And you would then need to go back and measure again in 5 years after the development. And certainly award-winning schemes that haven't been built are a concern, or haven't been completed. But you would have to go back and find out whether that was the case, whether the social value could be seen to have risen on that investment.
Can I just ask, has that not worked? We've had tower blocks in London for years, and residential tower blocks in the UK for years. Have we not done any work on? There's no work been done on whether or not those tower blocks have active and thriving communities in them?
Not so far as I know, no.
It's remiss of us, really, isn't it?
So, just to respond to that, the work that Barbara is hinting at is something that we have now started to look in the borough, because when we started to look at the impact of not only high rise but also high density that comes with the small sites, we found very little information out there in terms of what are the good principles, how do they actually function, what makes the possibility of a community or a neighborhood living within these schemes. We found very little or limited information around them.
Can't you make that a requirement that the developers should demonstrate the case that they are those developments?
They would try and say that it's exemplar because of the design, but it's about the perspective of residents who live in them.
Can I say that actually there was a period when we thought we weren't going to build tall buildings. That actually tall buildings were out, and they were in disgrace throughout from the late 70s to the early 2000s, pretty much. So actually it wasn't, and there were studies, there were a lot of studies. I mean, the book Estates, for example, it's a study of estates. Other people have done estates. They're generally negative. There are a few which almost say, in spite of it being a tower, there is actually a vibrant community for these and these reasons, because of the certain things, because it's never a binary question. I think we are in a new and relatively uncharted territory, and because of that I wanted to ask Shri a straight question, taking literally the words from the London Plan, which is what local authorities should be doing. It says boroughs should identify on maps in development plans the locations where tall buildings will be appropriate for development in principle, and should indicate the general building heights, etc., taking account of, and that in those three, you could read it to cover everything we've been saying, because they're talking about the economic growth, regeneration, new homes, the cumulative impact. It doesn't, I would say one thing that's missing in this is anything about making cohesive communities, place-making, the kind of things you're talking about, social capital, and so on. But assuming that is put in there, are you equipped as a local authority to actually deliver this extremely ambitious plan-led approach?
So,
with evidence and everything else, because one of your pieces of work has shown that there's no sign that there's evidence-based policy making going on. Can you do it?
Come to the nub of this, because in fact we are, we'll bring in Barbara in a moment, but the boroughs are now in a position where you can really localise these policies, because the Mayor has given the boroughs responsibility for defining what is a tall building and also for doing tall building strategies. And I think the point that there isn't enough evidence is a really important one. I think what Suman's just said is very important. I mean, it sounds as though boroughs don't yet have policies around, mixes and communities and families.
Or the capacity to build those policies.
Sorry?
Or the capacity to formulate those.
That's another issue.
Yeah. Capacity is a big issue, which I think we can come back later on. But Barbara has indicated, and then I want to bring David into play as well, because I'm sure, you got huge amount of ground to cover from what you heard.
I have a few disparate points. First of all, I was interested in knowing, when we talk about affordable housing, are we talking about the 80% of market, or are we talking of a social rent? Or because there's a huge difference, and I think a lot of us think the affordable is really not affordable anyway. So that would be that's one point. The other point is what matters hugely to me with this this explosion of tall buildings is what's happening to daylight. And do you have any policies that establish the distance that has to be allowed between two tall buildings? Because hearing that the social housing is on the lower 6 to 8 floors makes me think that they're going to be in pitch black, dark, and that's very often the case, is that the poorer you are, the less natural sunlight you get. The other point was, I've heard from several people working in South Quay that the transport situation there is dire, and that the local, I don't know if it's tube or rail, is not up to coping with the new influx of thousands of extra people. And likewise, I'd also heard that there's a real lack of parks and green space, which is also good for mental health. It's good for all kinds of things. It's not just for children. So hearing you talk, I'm very impressed with everything you have got in place, particularly when you're saying about design reviews and all those things, which are very important to us. But I get a sense that you are not in a position to say no, and I'm just wondering, why aren't you in a position to say no, that's too tall, we've got enough towers, who is going to say no?
So, great. I mean, I would love to be able to elaborate on all of these points, and also going back to what Sunan mentioned and yourself, Andrew. So if you pick from the last one, are we able to say no? We have been saying no to a number of schemes, and that also is a huge resource implication for the borough, because this year we have over 6 public inquiries that we have to deal with. Not necessarily all of public inquiries to deal with, and they are all related in some form or another to either impacts on amenity, which is sunlight, daylight, or the impacts on heritage. Tower Hamlets has almost 1/3 of the borough is conservation area, and we have over 2,000 listed buildings, archaeological priority areas, etc., etc. So we haven't even touched on those impacts, but that kind of sets also that some locations become concentrated for housing delivery of a certain type, which is why the South Quay keeps popping up compared to other parts of the borough. So we have been saying no to the schemes, and those reasons are very much about lack of amenity, open space, overdevelopment, too tall, impacts. But again, the reason I was saying earlier about impact-based assessment doesn't necessarily lead to good placemaking is based on a recent appeal decision where it's in Whitechapel. It's the Whitechapel Estate appeal. One of the reasons for refusal was amenity, lack of sunlight, daylight to the property. The inspector took the view that because you are an inner London borough and you are choosing to live in an inner London area, the loss of sunlight, daylight is not something that should be considered. It has to be accepted that you're living in an urban area. So that is the kind of case.
That's terrible.
You're kidding.
It's happened.
It is happened.
Which application was that?
Whitechapel Estate. It's Whitechapel Estate. So that
Whitechapel Estate?
Yes.
So these are social housing?
These are a mix of social housing and private, but as you say, rightly said, Barbara, some levels of loss of sunlight, daylight. But then also...
Are they single aspect as well?
They, I mean, I don't have the information ahead of me, but some might.
So the inspector attributed
yes.
Choice to every single one of those residents,
and
social housing or private rent. And they can just choose to live somewhere else.
And often in our borough, which is being, the whole of the borough is inner London, which we really struggle, and the national policy also is going down the same line. The NPPF, new NPPF under consultation, also kind of lines with that. So we are left with a situation where this case law then also is something that others are going to take on board. And we are really seriously
implications for
other boroughs as well. So this is a real issue for us. And we have this year over 4 or 5 of the appeals that's going to public inquiry. That is huge resource implication, where the issues that are refusal is sunlight, daylight, overlooking, privacy, and other aspects like heritage. So that's kind of, so we are saying no, but this particular area we are seeing those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to answer your question about the impacts on transport and new open space and infrastructure, that has been a real challenge, and which is why the opportunity area planning framework that's published now identifies what new capacities can be added, because that's not something as a local authority we can do, but it's something from TfL working with other partners. What we are committing to do is identifying those still money to contribute towards the projects that the OEPF then sets out. That includes new footbridges. And then the TfL, for example, we're looking about increasing capacity by having a different type of carriage for those DLR services, etc. So those challenges can only be addressed when there is a comprehensive overarching framework, not on a site-by-site work around that. To pick up on the affordable, I don't have the exact figures of the schemes that I discussed, but the borough's approach is we need affordable homes that are truly affordable for the local residents. We also are in the top 10% of the deprived boroughs in the country. So we can't really afford the 80% of market rent. Yeah. So our thrust is really about having truly affordable, and that's kind of the crux of all our planning pre-application discussions going forward.
Can I come in? When you said earlier, just for clarification, you said on the 35%, you said about 45% were affordable. This is a way back in your...
Sorry, 45% were family homes.
45% of the 35% were affordable. Yes. Now, did you mean units or bed spaces?
I meant units.
Units. And of that 45, that's about 15 homes out of 100, roughly. 15 homes would be... What, affordable or family homes?
Affordable family homes. So
affordable family homes. Yes. So would they be social rented?
They would be. That depends on scheme by scheme. The push is really about social rent. But in some instances, we may not have been able to secure that. And we can give you that information once I am able to speak to my housing colleagues. Yes. But the real push is to get them more as affordable as possible.
And one more question from me is, I'm still not clear. How much thought has gone in to how you're going to interpret these new London Plan policies?
So the new London Plan policies for us...
Which give you responsibility. You will have to develop your tall building strategies.
Yes.
You will define what is a tall building.
Yes. So the new local plan that's going through examination in September defines the tall building, which was what I set out earlier about the prevailing height. We identify locations. We have identified 5 locations. This has increased from the last local plan. It was 2, which was Canary Wharf and Aldgate. Now it's 5.
So it's all going back to that?
Yes. So we are defining zoning. We are also identifying the heights. We have undertaken a tall building study to identify how we come up with these restrictions, because we are going to be examined, and that would be an interesting process to also reflect, because we will have representations from applicants to say, why can I not have that tall? The most important thing that we currently lack is an understanding of the quality of homes that we are building in these tall buildings. So that is the work that we are now currently undertaking, but we are struggling with resources. What the work will look at is quality of life of those residents who live in these high-rise, high-dense scheme. And we are looking at completed examples where people have lived in at least for a year or 2 years to really understand. Because the tall buildings we are talking about is very different to the ones in the 70s and 80s. We are talking about single sites delivering 800 homes. 600 homes on all very small site. This level of vertical living is very new and comparable to places like Hong Kong.
Also the proximity, you know, the 60s estates, you've got towers, but they're spread out in the landscape, the low density, and now, you know, if I think of Lewisham Gateway, for example, which is in my borough, which, you know, I let's just say I'm not particularly keen on in terms of design. You've got now towers going up very close to existing towers, and with all the impacts on lights and everything. Yeah.
So to respond to Barbara's question about how do we do the spacing, etc. So we do it, at the moment we don't have in the policy to say this height you have to be this part. But that is something we would test as part of the environmental impact assessment to ensure that there is sufficient overlap or lack of or open space so that they're not impacted. But a minimum would at least be 18 meters, but that is nothing. Minimum is at least 18 meters, but that is nothing.
It's nothing.
No,
so I think
that's
nothing.
Between towers.
Yes, not necessarily for height, but more for clearance, which is why I think that we don't necessarily have a policy to say distance. The 18 meters comes from the historical thing of but then that is not how we manage tall building applications. We really manage it through impacts.
Do you have a density limit as well, alongside the height limit?
Unfortunately, no.
Aggregate?
Unfortunately, we don't have a density limit. But also with the Mayor's housing SPG and others, what we are trying, and with the density metrics gone, that's going to be a real challenge.
No, but but I think you're free to set your densities. I don't think the fact that the density matrix has gone from the Mayor, I don't think it rules out your freedom to set aggregate densities. For example, it doesn't have to be a site.
You now have to do your own growth evaluation and set your own density matrices for different frameworks, for different parts of the borough. There's nothing to stop Tower Hamlets, though, saying the Mayor should just update his density matrix.
We are incorporating the existing density matrix in some form or another in the local plan. And the work that I mentioned about tall residential scheme, the study that we're doing, would also help us inform. So there's a huge piece of work that the borough needs to do, and which we are struggling to find resource to do, is tall building, tall residential schemes, and how we come up with guidance around density matrix.
So sorry, you're doing this on your own. I mean, you're not the only borough that's. I mean, can't you take a London-wide view of this if you need evidence? It doesn't.
Which is what kind of we are hoping that we can open up in this forum to find a way of how we can do it, because it is challenging, it is time-consuming. Given that 3/4 of the borough is opportunity area. Before we had only Isle of Dogs. Now we have large area of city fringe, Isle of Dogs, and housing zone. So that essentially means a huge area of the borough as opportunity area.
Could I just ask, are you looking at medium height, high density?
Absolutely.
So are you doing a lot of studies on that?
Absolutely. So we are looking at a range of them, rising from very tall to also the 20, the 15, looking at what opportunities they present and what are the challenges and how they are able to mitigate impacts.
Chair, can I bring in David now?
Tony wants to come in.
Can I just suggest, Chair, very briefly, Navin, that perhaps we should invite some of the new executive mayors for the boroughs, you know, Lewisham, Newham, and invite John Biggs, who we all know, of course, for Tower Hamlets, to a future, and Hackney, a future session, and actually have this discussion, because ultimately they're accountable, responsible, rather than the poor officers who are working very hard to do what they're trying to do.
I think the Mayor's position, our Mayor's position, is very much about managing growth through really managing tall buildings, and the borough not becoming a place for just tall buildings, which is what it seems to be at the moment. We are doing our best to resist, but that would be fantastic.
Can I ask you, Shri, as a final question, just on this, that would it help you if there were, this is, to a certain extent, this is as localising a strategic responsibility. Would it help if there was more evidence and support?
Absolutely.
From the Mayor himself?
Absolutely. And this is something we really would welcome, because there's only so much we can do with the resource that we currently have. But this kind of evidence gathering, etc., and the challenges of dealing with, for example, the amenity. How are we going to deal with sunlight, daylight, if case law is the way it is and the way the NPPF is going? and how do we actually deliver better quality of living for family homes. Those, and then particularly for affordable family, there is no guidance around there. We don't have
no guidance
around there.
That's exactly what our section's about.
Yes, guidance around there, and also the knowledge about how are RPs managing, what are the challenges, how are the residents living. All of that information would be really helpful. In the absence of that, we are really struggling with just few case studies.
David, floor is yours. You've got hell of a lot to cover, and please go through everything. Thank you.
Yeah. I may reiterate some of the points that Shree's made, because I mean they are sort of common points. In terms of how we generally deal with tall buildings, our core strategy, which was adopted in 2011, sort of identified the Harrow Wildstone opportunity area as like an area that would be suitable for tall buildings. That partly stems from the appeal decision that Navin sort of mentioned, which was decided in about 2010, and that established the principle of tall buildings in Harrow Metropolitan Centre, particularly around the Harrow and the Hill Metropolitan Line station. That appeal was only dismissed on design grounds, but the principle of a tall building of around about 20 stories was sort of accepted. From the core strategy, we prepared an area action plan that covered Harrow and Wildstone. That was prepared in conjunction with the TfL and the Mayor of London, and that was adopted in 2012. That defined tall buildings as anything more than 30 metres. It also introduced the concept of taller buildings, and that was any building that's 2 or 3 stories above the prevailing predominant height in the area. And that was kind of in recognition of more the trying to recognise the potential for taller buildings, but then also trying to manage the level of change within an area. The AAP also includes policies in relation to trying to avoid clusters of tall buildings as well. So there was also a concern, particularly in relation to some of our protected view corridors. So we have a number of local view corridors that sort of focus on St Mary's and Harrow Hill, which we seek to make sure that the tall buildings don't intrude upon those. As a result, or subsequent to the 2010 appeal decision in relation to the Dead Dara site, we had an application in 2015 for tall building on that site. Again, it's very much one of those things where the tallest element of that is 20 stories, but the building heights on that site range from 6 up to 20 stories. So it's very much a lot of our sites where we may be looking to potentially accommodate taller buildings, we'll always be looking for a range of heights. So it's not just always, particularly in Harrow, a lot of our capacity isn't, in terms of housing capacity, isn't envisaged to be coming from taller buildings. So most of our capacity is going to be from a couple of large sites, particularly the Kodak site, where there's a range of heights there, and the maximum height is around about 14 stories. So we do kind of go beyond the Mayor's definition of tall buildings, but we have, we sort of do have a range of heights, and particularly for something like the Kodak site that has an outline planning permission for about 2,000 homes, again specifying the height limits, and that was done very much on a sort of master planning sort of basis. In terms of sort of development pressure coming forward, clearly we are seeing a lot more interest in terms of building heights going up. So reference was made to the Palmerston Dulles scheme, an Origin Housing Association scheme in Wildstone. That was 17 stories. That was the highest element in terms of 17 stories. Again, it was a mixture of building heights. Some of the rationale behind having 17 stories, first of all, was the affordable housing provision. So they did hit 40% affordable housing on that. Another aspect was in terms of trying to achieve housing yield from that site, but trying to avoid essentially a described as a monolithic wall of development of the same height. There is this desire to sort of articulate the the sort of heights, just to create that sort of interest. In terms of how we actually deal with applications or deal with proposals, I mean, whilst the area action plans set the parameters, first I think in terms of the emerging pressures in terms of housing, policy changes in terms of London plan, the current AAP set parameters but didn't really go into a detailed sort of master planning process. We have where we have had some interest for tall buildings in a very small localised area. We've tried to put through or establish some master planning principles, but the difficulty is, as Shu was sort of alluding to, you've got 3 or 4 different landowners who may not be sharing information, may not want to work together, so it's actually very hard as a local planning authority at pre-application stage to try to bring an overall sort of complete picture in the absence of a master plan that has been prepared and gone through a form of consultation or an examination, that sort of thing. So we do struggle with that in terms of that sort of thing. We have, in the context of Harrow and Wealdstone also becoming a housing zone and ongoing development pressures, we do have a design review panel in place. So they certainly do see all the larger schemes. And that is sort of, they obviously see that when they're first initially establishing some of the principles through to some of the actual design details. So they see it, for larger schemes, they may see it up to 3 times in terms of the design development process. We naturally also have in-house resources in terms of conservation officers, urban design officers, as well as the design review panel. We are somewhat fortunate insofar as that we have RAF Northolt, which is where the Queen flies in if she's been out on a journey, and that creates some RAF imposed sort of safeguarding height limits, which tend to actually, we've had proposals for anything up to 28 stories, and those initial pre-app discussions, they've had to come down simply because of the the RAF objections to that. So that is actually something which is a bit of a saving grace. But yeah, I mean, there is certainly that sort of ongoing sort of pressure. In terms of considerations such as affordable housing, I mean, in terms of some of the more recent schemes that we've approved that have sort of been in the order of 17 stories, we've had elements of 17 stories. We've hit 40% affordable housing on that. 40%, yes. It has, for one particular scheme, it was...
Palmerston scheme?
Palmerston scheme was 40%. It was also...
How's that broken down?
It was about 60% intermediate, but that was actually set at a local policy level because we had already had a fair bit of social rent housing coming forward, particularly when grant was good, in terms of affordable housing delivery. So at a plan level, we actually set for that particular area of the borough a 10-year swap.
How much have you managed to achieve in Dundara site affordable?
In terms of the what is now the Hyde Barrett's College Square scheme, that's 16% affordable housing. That was that was viability tested and those sort of things, and that's what came out. There was also a review once it started, commenced development. That also came out. It basically couldn't, support more than 16%. I mean, each scheme has obviously had its own unique characteristics. So in terms of that particular site, it was delivering a public square, space for a new library, and so there was other planning gain that sort of came from it. So it was that planning balance that was sort of struck from a viability point of view. And then a more recent scheme that, again 17 stories, but that's 40%. Again, in that particular case, it was viability tested, and the mix that's come out is more intermediate than affordable rent or social rent. Again, we are sort of testing that, and there'll be a late stage review with that as well. So we are sort of hitting the 40%, but not necessarily 10-year split compliant. In terms of the types of dwellings that we're actually getting within that, Harrow, in terms of our local plan, decision was made not to include size mix sort of requirements within the actual plan itself. So we don't have any policy that says you need to be 45% 3 beds or above. We do, through the pre-app and the development management application process, our housing colleagues do have a tenure mix which they seek a tenure mix and also a size mix that they seek to do, and that's updated on a fairly regular basis, simply based on our waiting lists in terms of actually getting, building and securing the affordable housing that we know we'll be placing people into. So that's a slightly different sort of approach to some other boroughs, but it allows us to be a bit more responsive to ongoing changes in terms of waiting lists and housing need. I think that sort of summarises the key of the.
Can I just ask on that? So you're building the properties based upon the demand on your waiting list. Is that what you're saying?
That is how we negotiate the site-by-site planning applications.
Oh, okay. No, that's good. How do you think that has affected the size mix that you have in your plans?
From a practical point of view, we do tend to get a lot of 2-bed, 4-person units, because that gives our nominations team a fair bit of flexibility, because they can, if they must and they have to, they can put in families into that, depending on obviously the age of the children, that sort of thing. But we certainly would like to get more 3 beds than what we are. But there's again, in terms of towers, we're certainly not getting a large number of 3 beds generally. Certainly we're finding it's quite difficult for developers to sell market housing in terms of 3 beds and above. People basically can't get mortgages if they're doing it through the private sale. But we also...
Sorry, they can't get mortgages if...
In terms of 3 beds, the demand is certainly there for affordable housing in 3 bed. There's also an element of demand for 3 and 4 bed in private sale, but it's actually quite difficult for what we're finding from developers is that they actually find it difficult to sell the 3 and 4 beds for private sale, because essentially people can't secure the mortgages. So that's why we
mortgages.
Can I add that stamp duty changes have softened the market at those upper limits, 600,000. So developers will struggle to sell them, so they won't build them.
So where we are getting 3 beds and 4 beds, that's where we try to emphasise getting them in the affordable tenure, because that's where we know we've got people we can place into them. We know there's a demand there, so that's.
Given the demographic makeup of Harrow, for example, what proportion of family-sized dwellings are you able to get from those high-rise buildings that you already have either built or permissions granted, and the others in pipeline?
Yeah, in terms of the most recent sort of...
Socially rented in particular, yeah.
In terms of overall tenure splits, we are unfortunately around about 10% in terms of, say, 3 beds and above.
How does it compare to the actual requirement within the borough? Because like most areas, there's glut of studio, 1-2 bedroom, but studio and 1 bedroom sort of flats and dwelling units. But family-sized dwellings are key to accommodate the local needs. So in relation to local need, how does this square up in terms of what I see very low amount of family-sized dwellings?
In terms of the tower, tall buildings, if we're calling the dwelling mix in terms of 3 beds and above would be below what the overall sort of borough need might be. But we do have larger sites where we are getting a greater proportion of family-sized dwellings. because that is how we're able to secure them. The design works better as well. So that's where, particularly in a borough such, an outer London borough such as Harrow, tall buildings are just one element of our overall sort of housing, the housing that we'll be delivering. So for the larger sites, for the more strategic sites that, where we're getting 2,000 homes, in a relatively low rise, certainly lower than central London, obviously, in terms of building heights, that's where we are sort of securing more larger dwellings in terms of the mix.
Marvellous. You will, yes.
So the Skyline campaign is very interested in outer London in terms of its capacity to provide a huge amount of extra housing, because there is a lot of land there. And particularly, a lot of the housing that is existing is beginning to be past its sell-by date. I mean, there are acres and acres of quite old two-storey houses that could be turned into much more efficient and denser housing. And we think that that's where the attention should go now, is to find housing models that and typologies that look right in that setting, that still are appropriate to deliver an outer London look, which is completely different from a central London look. But I don't really see the need for these tall buildings. I really think, and they alter completely the feeling. Once you start getting 2 or 3, 20, I know you said you have to stay lower than 28, but even 17 stories in that area, they just completely change the historic identity of those areas. And once you've got them, you'll never ever get rid of them. So I'm just wondering, what function are these tall buildings fulfilling? Because they're not delivering the bulk of your housing. But even just 1 or 2 of them will forever damage, the views, and it's slightly keeping up with the Joneses. There's a feeling that the outer London is getting towers because they're coming on to something that was good for central London, so let's have one too. But I don't know what the other reasons might be.
Does anyone want to comment on what Barbara said?
I'd like to hear from David, and in fact, this is what, in a sense, I was going to sort of lead on to in terms of, as far as I know, Harrow's sort of planning policy approach was that, you got these opportunity areas, that's where you'll have, that's where you'll maximize density, and therefore you if it means, which it generally happens, high-rise buildings, and that would mean that there'll be less or pretty much no pressure on other areas, and therefore maintain the suburban character, in the rest of the borough. How much of that is now relevant, or is there going to be pressure to go high, put it that way, in areas where we never thought that we would require to develop high-rise buildings? Because it is about not just historic heritage, it is about suburban heritage. Stop that massive urbanization and bring in all the problems that come with it. So, how does Harrow, in that sense, as an outer London borough, cope, and what the vision is?
Yeah. In terms of the draft London plan, so by way of context, our current London plan target is around about 600 homes per year. About 400 homes per year would be coming from the opportunity area, and so that's where it's a metropolitan centre. There are elements of tall buildings there anyway, around about sort of 10, 11 storey buildings, historic sort of office buildings that have have either been converted to residential or remain in poor quality. And then the rest would sort of be windfall sites, which generally would be in other sort of district centres. So Harrow and Wealdstone was always intended to be the bulk of our sort of, very accommodating growth. With the new Mayor's draft London plan target, our target goes from 600 up to about 1,400 homes per year. 69% of that is identified as small sites, so the suburban intensification side of things. Now that is, most of the London boroughs have concerns about how the Mayor has derived the small sites target. We're also significantly concerned about how deliverable it is, and we're also significantly concerned about what its implications would be, because essentially it is suburban intensification. It's taking it's essentially saying, convert your family-size housing into an additional 2.2, flats. Now, if we have our own evidence base in terms of housing need that suggests that we have a strong demand for family-size housing, yet we're being set targets for small sites that can only really be facilitated by losing family-size housing, we see that there's a significant mismatch about that. So in terms of just pure numbers, in terms of actually losing what you've got, that's our biggest concern, to be honest, because that's what the Mayor's trying to encourage. So and it does go against what was our sort of current adopted policy in terms of here's we call it an opportunity area, but it's realistically a metropolitan centre and a district centre and a road that connects it. It's already the most intensified, developed sort of area in the borough. It certainly does have some contextual constraints in terms of conservation areas, Harrow Hill, St Mary's and those sort of things. So it does have its constraints and its issues. But it has sort of been the established principle for the past 7 or 8 years that that's where the development focus would be. How that development within the area is it's still a matter of is it this height or that height? That's where there is that growing pressure to go higher, and that's where I think certainly any local plan review we were going to respond to that pressure anyway. But on the other hand, we are then saying, well, that's just one part of the equation. The rest of the equation is actually 2/3 of our capacity is going to come from suburbia, essentially. So that's, and the Mayor has his overall target, and then he has some small sites targets. Now, our reading of the draft plan is that, in effect, what he's really concerned about is the overall housing delivery. So does it therefore mean if our boroughs, particularly outer London boroughs, now being faced with a choice, do we accommodate our growth as the Mayor envisages, with most of it being in the suburban parts of the borough, or do we start to look at greater than envisaged development within our opportunity areas? That's not something we've progressed through at any stage at this point in terms of our thinking, but that is essentially the pressure that we'll be looking at.
But if you turned a lot of the 2 stories into 3 stories, I'm sure you could still keep the family homes and maybe have a flat above that. And I'm quite familiar with the borough because I was doing some work there, and there are high streets that have parades of shops that could also have some flats above for, say, older people who very often occupy the big family homes and haven't downsized. So I think there is a whole issue that needs to be looked at in depth in terms of being more efficient with the housing.
I think that comes back to simple land assembly. That's we have difficulties getting 2 adjoining neighbours on relatively large sites in the town centre to talk to each other and facilitate a development that comes forward in a comprehensive way. If you look at a row of shops, you will have multiple owners, and so how do you actually deliver a comprehensive scheme that, yes, certainly may increase the heights, and you get effectively an extra 50% housing effectively. How do you actually facilitate that? And so that's, in a way you could argue that the capacity is there in terms of what the Mayor is suggesting, but actually the deliverability and actually making it happen is something which is unlikely to occur. So
that's one of those you need to do.
David, I want to say thank you because I think we've got. Time. We've got quite a lot more to cover, and I want to.
Nikki, I think Sunan wanted to just come in.
Okay, moving on to Sunan's section.
Very quick answers really would be fine. The 2/3 which are dispersed, if you like, not part of the town centre and so on. I think you said that are these existing vacant sites? The small sites.
In terms of the 2/3,
because there must be quite a lot of still, railway lands and and pocket sites and so on around? And is there a comprehensive register and a policy for suburban densification in place? And the other question I had was, in places where tall buildings proposals are being brought forward, do you say, we first want to see whether you can achieve your aims and a decent place with lower rise or medium rise, rather than immediately accept it as a tall building application?
Yeah. In terms of the 2/3, the Mayor has essentially done a theoretical model. So those sites aren't identified. Historically, we have identified small windfall sites outside the borough, and they are your vacant sites and that sort of thing. But the Mayor has actually, contrary to what we think it's contrary to National Planning Policy Framework, just essentially come up with a number and expects us to deliver it.
So just to be clear, this number does not relate to identified sites, as in the Schla, for example.
Yeah, a small proportion reflects the larger windfall sites. The rest of it is modelled.
It's modelled rather than identified.
Yeah.
Okay, that's critical.
You know that.
Right.
Yeah.
The boroughs are contesting the evidence, basically.
Yeah. And the second question, do you always say, we want to see how you can achieve this with a lower rise?
Just apologies to the Chair in terms of, from our perspective, you kind of, from an Outer London borough, it's difficult to separate the tall buildings discussion from the small sites discussion, because that's the tension which we're sort of faced with. So I will focus on the tall buildings, but I just think it needs to be put in context for us at least. So
I absolutely agree that they are interrelated, and also 0.25 hectares is actually, as a site, can take a very tall building. Which we shouldn't forget. Small sites can take tall buildings as well.
In terms of, the question about do we ask people to explore options? Yes. So we would expect them to
ask.
Do we require policy? No, but through the design review process in particular, in the early stages of that process, we'll be saying, what is your context, what's your character, what's your options, what's your design development. We expect to see that sort of process. And sometimes the taller element is actually simply as a result of the design process in order to break up the massing. So you might be able to go uniformly a certain height, but then that creates its own problems from a design perspective. But we do certainly ask them to do that. And in terms of our own regeneration sites themselves, so there's a couple of sites, particularly the existing civic centre site, we have deliberately taken a decision to go more of a mansion block style sort of approach, for the same sort of reasons that we're discussing today. So, we are doing it ourselves.
That's in line, actually, with what the Mayor has also said. He's interested.
I've got a quick question about that, David.
We want to move on to Tom's question.
Can I just quickly ask you about Harrow? Is that okay? I've been involved in quite a few of those projects that you talked about. Do you feel that there's a pressure to just accept tall buildings as a new typology within your borough? And I think it's great that the civic centre site has your own site. You've held it back, and on the Kodak site you've got a very different, and it's a new typology for Harrow, isn't it? It's not suburban by any means, is it? And do you think that you're able to stop the tall buildings, or you think they're appropriate?
From an officer point of view, I think we assess it on its merits and its playing balance and the various different constraints. And for the taller buildings, we have sort of recommended them for approval. Like to say that the taller buildings aren't entirely tall buildings; they are just aspects of a broader scheme. So,
Can I just comment on that? I'm so sorry, I'm so aware of time as well, but there's something I just have got to get sort of clear in my mind from earlier conversations, including this one. It appears to me, and perhaps you can confirm it or otherwise, that the London plan is effectively forcing boroughs to accept a typology of living for which there is little supporting evidence that it is either healthy or good for them. I mean, say, no, you're wrong, Andrew, please do. If there is supporting elements, I'm particularly looking at the Mayor's design advocates, because But are we coming up with designs for which there is no evidence that those designs are healthy or good for people?
I don't think I think the London plan is silent on quality of life for the people who will be in those places.
And do you think it should have a
Yes,
voice?
it should.
Yes,
Definitely.
It should have a voice.
It's not necessarily saying
about typologies and health.
It
And
indirectly.
everyone's nodding, just for the record.
Yes.
Everyone,
Could I-
no, one person is
Could I just
Gazette's not nodding.
devil's advocate for the Economist's Intelligence Unit? Every year it does the global livability ranking. Last year, Melbourne, Vienna, Vancouver, Toronto and Calgary, 4 of those 5 have high-rise living. So, we should probably be taking best practice from Australia and Canada and see how they do it.
But all those, I know those city
May I say,
plans,
yes.
they don't have many high-rise.
I do.
And they have family, some of them have real good family policies.
And
high-rise.
a lot, I've heard this before, and a lot of those families will tell me, well, yes, that's the urban living, but at the weekend we've got our place in the country.
Yeah.
So that's not the same argument as
No.
this is your home.
Yeah.
And also, I love those international arguments that assume everywhere else has no social problems. They talk about Barcelona,
No, they've got high
New
house
York
prices
and all the
too.
rest of it. And they think, no social problems, much better. But that was the question I really want to ask. Tom, I'm sorry, I'm correct.
Well, it's partly gone to this question anyway, which is about what the London plan should say, really, about particularly in terms of it's to our architects, our 3 architects. Yes. How you think that the London Plan and Borough should be thinking about tall residential buildings as a sustainable source of affordable family housing, and can they be, I suppose, and what should the London Plan be saying about it?
Well, I personally think it's barking up the wrong tree.
Barking up the wrong tree.
I think I don't think it is the ideal typology for families. There certainly will be the old family that will enjoy living in a tower, but I think towers are, we shouldn't forget, they're way more expensive to build. They're way more expensive to maintain. They take a lot longer to go through planning, so they sort of blight sites for much longer. And they're just thoroughly disliked by a lot of local people. So there are a lot of reasons why they should be a last resort, particularly for families. We were hearing earlier that I think Paul was saying that in the Old Kent Road, which I really worry about because it's now Colin Wilson calling the shots there, and no wonder we're going to have a whole lot of towers, but it's 1 and 2 bedrooms, and that's because it's probably young people who find it glamorous and exciting to live in towers, and that's absolutely fine. But should the City of London suffer because a few wealthy individuals want the kicks of looking down on everybody else? And, I think we've got enough towers now, and we should say enough is enough. I really do feel that.
I just wanted to kind of say that this tower typology is a natural outcome, at least in Tower Hamlets context, because of the size of the borough.
Could you just speak up a bit?
Sorry, I missed that. Sorry.
I just wanted to add to that, to say the tall buildings is a natural outcome of a very target-based approach in terms of delivering 3,500 or 3,900 homes per year in a very small borough, which has 1/3 of the area as conservation. So clearly, this is going to focus all the growth in small areas, resulting into tall towers. So what would be great is if the boroughs, if the mayor could work, the GLA could work with the boroughs to identify where they are delegating targets to boroughs, the particular challenges that the boroughs have, what particular guidance or relevant work that could come in partnership with the borough. For example, what we need may be different to what Harrow needs in terms of its population. So it's almost like, yes, there is a target-based approach. Yes, the boroughs will do their best to deliver them, but there are challenges in delivering good places, and that may be where the evidence or guidance or whatever work needs to be done to deliver that growth, we need to identify it jointly.
Thank you. Yes.
I slightly take a slightly different view from Barbara, in that I don't think that actually per se in this document, in the draft London plan sections on tall buildings, are not saying that we should have tall buildings. It is saying that tall buildings should form part of a plan-led approach to changing or developing an area. You know, plan-led approach has been argued for years and years and years. Instead of which we've always had reactive development control. So the fact that the London plan now has a plan-led approach enshrined in it is a very good thing. But it's actually tiny 3 words, plan-led approach, but the implications are absolutely gigantic. And the local boroughs don't have the capacity to put in place a plan-led approach. They don't have the evidence base. There's no means of sharing it properly London-wide. And it seems to me now, you know, having welcomed this, that I think the mayor can't walk away from this and say it's up to the boroughs to do it. In principle, that's great, but actually, unless they have the tools, they can't do it. But if you actually expand this, the B in Appendix 2, Policy D8, to include the conversation we just had about community making, place making, and quality of life, it'll actually shift the conversation about tall buildings from the skyline. See, for example, I don't think there should be a special skyline approach to tall buildings. The skyline's only one of many issues about tall buildings. What is it like to be right next to it? What is it like to be in it? What is it like for the local town centre and the people who are going to live in it and the communities that are going to hopefully thrive in these developments? The focus should be there, and tall buildings should have a particularly more onerous test for all the reasons we know, which is also included, by the way, in the London plan. There is a graduated test for taller buildings. And I think if you really do that, and if the local authorities had the capacity and the support, then actually this policy should be a great step forward, I think.
So what do you think? How do you think that, given what you said about capacity constraints, how do you think the policy could be strengthened?
Well, I think there needs to be. I don't see any option but to be more proactive from the centre to help this evidence base to actually strengthen design review and the scrutiny. I think what Diana said was extremely interesting about, you know, a true take on social capital, on the kind of quality of place and community especially, and diversity of community which we're trying to create. Really focus on people, really, is what we're saying. Is actually it's the people that matter more than, you know, whether, you know, what ultimately, of course, the people decide on the skyline, but actually rather the emphasis being on the skyline as a visual aesthetic thing. You know, it should be about what is it like for people, and the skyline will definitely come into it because they will form views. But this plan-led approach, together with genuine local consultation, for which also, by the way, we don't have the right tools yet at this scale. You know, at a scale of a whole local authority, we still are consulting in a pretty perfunctory way. Not because we're not trying. Everybody tries, but they don't know how to do it. But using digital technology, new ways of communicating and consulting, it should be possible for a local authority to put in place a plan-led approach. I would put my eggs in that basket with proper tests, rather than, you know, zero in too much on whether this building is too tall or short. Because I think that those problems will be solved if we focus on real quality and people.
How does that translate, Sunand, into, there's one line on residential tall buildings in the plan.
I would separate residential.
And there's design and there's location, but there's nothing about how you make them work for communities.
Well,
as you've been describing.
in this page, there's 3 things here. We need to add the 4th sentence, which captures what we've been saying about social capital, about communities, and actually put it number 1, rather than start with visual impact. You know, start with saying that above all, they've got to work, and also alternative means of doing the same thing need to be exhausted. I think the last resort question is a good one.
You know, when they were doing the Olympic site and they were doing the Olympic Village, I challenged the OPDC to show me a mixed tenure courtyard development a courtyard development in London that worked anywhere. absolutely anywhere.
Mixed tenure one.
A mixed tenure courtyard development that worked somewhere in London, and after 9 months they couldn't show me one that worked socially, that didn't, and until they came to one that had, it was £350 service charges a month, and that one worked. But can you? Yeah. Well, can you? Well, I'm happy to go because I still haven't seen one that's a reasonable price. Can you tell me? Can you show me any examples anywhere in London of a tower block over 20 floors, mixed tenure, mixed families that actually works? Have we got a template of where these blocks either aren't socially exclusive or a social problem? Are there any examples? If you can't think of them now, please send them on, because I know of none.
So, the mystery to me is, having lived 5 years in New York and loving New York, is that in New York you do have tower blocks that work well, where there is a community.
They're not mixed tenure.
Possibly.
They're either condos
or mixed tenure.
Yes,
projects.
Yeah, but as a typology, I feel very strongly that it's not part of London's DNA. And so, I don't think there's something, when you mention Vancouver and Vienna, these completely different places, I think we have to stick to something that somehow works in this climate, in this social mix, in this city of many centres. You're not mentioning very much historic assets, which matter enormously to me,
Yeah, I would really like us to get on to how, some of these places you just mentioned, Vancouver's one, Auckland's another, there are a string of others, actually have policies on not putting families very high up in tower blocks, and they actually design the tower blocks in relation to, and we don't, and we don't have any guidance in our London plan, any policies in our London plan about that, and we're looking to, you've got 3 architects now, we're looking to you to sort of suggest some of the things you might want to see, and obviously mixed tenure is the first one, and how do you achieve that in a way that makes living work?
But I'm also sorry to interrupt there, but do we want mixed tenure though? If we don't want children to be high up, then do we want, when you're building a tower block, it shouldn't be mixed tenure, it should just be for...
You're looking at a tower block like one thing, a tower, we've already established that, we should be looking at bigger sites, whether it's by assembly of several small ones, or by the Tower Hamlets approach of forcing the developers to get together before they bring forward schemes, i.e. having a collective master plan, or by the local authority itself doing a very, very hard line master plan and then saying, this is what these are the parameters, build to those, which means identifying all those provisions. And it'll be what used to be called mixed development actually in the 60s and 70s was actually not mixed tenure, it was mixed different sizes of
so you had your maisonettes and you had your tower block and...
Your suggestion is that...
Actually, going back to those, if you look at some of those now, which have partly been under right to buy, some of them are leaseholds, you will find mixed tenure, pretty high density developments. I've lived in one which wasn't a courtyard, and it wasn't that tall because it's 7 stories. It seemed very tall at the time, and it's a community of a number of 7-story blocks. They're quite close together. It was a happy community. There were leaseholders and rent people. But it had grown up over 50 years is how long that community's been there, and that's why it's cohesive. It's not, it's a community built through history, and I don't think we can instantly create those kinds of things, but we can create the conditions in which that will thrive. And one thing I would do, for example, you shouldn't have families high up in a tower. Yeah. You could actually have a policy which says no more than 6 to 8 stories, or you have to bloody well, prove why it's okay.
I didn't mean mixed tenure. So I actually meant whether you put family-sized housing in the.
So that absolutely creates a conflict. Surely, it's a conflict of policies, which is if you're going to allow tower developments on small patches of land, and you also have a policy requirement that you must have family homes in there and you must accommodate families, you're actually squeezing people into an unhealthy environment because of the
unless
conflict
that
of
is
those
part of a
policies.
bigger development,
And
where
that's-
that's got the one
yeah,
and two,
yeah.
and that's got the families, i.e. the old-fashioned mixed development.
Not in isolation.
Yeah.
Dinah.
Yeah, I think I've got another view, like there's three different views here. Looking at the statistics, I'm concerned that in the inner London boroughs in particular, we have levels of overcrowding that are unlikely to reduce significantly. So we need to understand how many of our families are living in levels of overcrowding and will continue to do so, despite kind of efforts to alleviate that.
We know those numbers, don't we?
Yeah. And I know, for example, I've been presented the figures in Islington, and I mean, they're probably similar in Tower Hamlets. What I don't feel we've got a handle on is the relationship between those levels of overcrowding and whether we will perpetuate those, because children live in tower blocks at the moment in units that weren't designed for them to live in. And 1 and 2 bedroom flats, people will buy and rent 1 and 2 bedroom flats, and they will have children. And my concern is that because we're designing them not for children, that when they live up there, they're at a further disadvantage that may be impacted by other issues such as poverty. And that what's really, really critical is their relationship to their local neighbourhood through those spaces on the ground. And so we've been looking at relationship between design and children's lived experiences, and I can tell you that the ones that live up high, they don't come down and play because they can't call down to their friends because it's too far, and they don't go down there, and that's a direct impact on their lives in many, many ways. So whilst I very much think that families should not live above the 4th, 5th and 6th floors, there's a problem in that they will. And so how can we make sure that the nuanced approach to design, where we fully understand the shared spaces and the communal spaces and the open spaces and those relationships that go right up to the front door, are of a high enough quality in a building so that they could potentially take an overcrowded situation, because otherwise I don't think we're building a sustainable city. We're kind of kidding ourselves that everything we're doing is going to solve the problems of what's already there, and we're not going to do that, and we may be creating new problems.
How would you do that through a plan, though? Because you're saying
I think
a plan can't necessarily anticipate every choice citizens make.
I think the wording in the documents at the moment is too broad in terms of social use. I think that needs to come out at the top level, but I think developers need to demonstrate that the kind of daily lives of people will be carried out in a certain way by, for example, describing how it will be living on the 17th floor of that tower block and how you will relate to your neighbours on the ground, and you will access those spaces, and you can visually and physically describe those things
sorry
and
to press you
assess
on
them.
this, but are you saying to a developer that yes, you've got this 2-bedroom flat on the 15th floor, but I want you to show me how, if that's now lived in by a family, it's still okay?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That's tough.
What you're saying, Dinah, what you're saying is that every single tower block has to be designed to take children to the top of it.
I think it needs.
And I don't know that that's very.
I think the developer who builds out that flat is not intending for it to be lived in by children. But for the same reason that public buildings, may be visited by children, and therefore they need to be safe for children as well. So do tower blocks, right?
Someone might move in without children, but then they have children.
They might be grandparents who are looking after their grandchildren.
What I actually heard was don't build tower blocks.
Well, yes, that would push you very hard against building tower blocks, wouldn't it?
But these tower blocks, we're kidding ourselves if you're thinking that they're built for wealthy people. Because the service charge, the monthly service charge, is going to be the equivalent almost of a rent. So so if you're that wealthy and you have a 2-bedroom flat and you've got 3 children, you're going to move. You're not going to stay there and pay huge service charges. So I think what you're describing is social housing in tower blocks as we used to have, but we're not talking. we're not talking about that here. We're talking
I think that's a very fair comment and a way through in the triangulation of all this, because in fact we are talking about affordable housing particularly, and particularly social rented, and what we can do is we can think about where that goes. We've had some solutions. Obviously on the larger sites, families don't need to go in the tower block bit, but on smaller sites, then you've got a cut-off of the lower floors, and one has to redesign the tower block of the lower floors.
I think where I'm going with this is that some of the design aspects that work for children work for everybody else as well. So like what I see that I really am disappointed with is the kind of hotelification, if you like, of these buildings. So that you're expected to kind of move very quickly through a lobby. There's no sense of you kind of hanging out there, chatting to your neighbours, you know, meeting people of different ages, and that continues through this slightly kind of security and defensive approach to the whole neighbourhood. So there's the block, it's got its own space. That we need to be able to task developers with describing the lived experiences of a number of different things, and that journey to the front door is so often forgotten about and is part of the public realm to a certain extent. That's not in the plan at the moment in terms of your experience of a tall building. It really is about the skyline, isn't it, and how it affects the street. It doesn't even talk about the shared spaces outside, because I think it's true to say that this was written with regards to commercial buildings primarily, wasn't it? And not anticipating the huge growth of housing. So it really does need to dovetail with the supplementary housing design guidance, doesn't it?
There are, if you look at the chapter which contains a tall, we're right now on the London plan.
Yeah.
You look at the chapter 3, contains a tall buildings policies, D8, but it's also long before that. There's a lot of policies about design and housing design and so on.
Yeah.
But you will have scrutinised them carefully, I've read them several times, but in your view, they don't really deal with tower blocks. Those design policies don't deal with the kind of spatial interior.
No, they don't. I don't think they do. No.
There is something which is quoted in the briefing, which you've all got, just saying you need small core, number of flats around a core.
I'm worried about the small core approach, because I think it's not.
Would you agree with that?
I don't see why it's very communally focused. You know, it suggests that you've got a couple of neighbours, and everybody knows that that's not a strong community if you've only got 2 or 3 neighbours that you know. I think that's problematic as a direction.
Can I just make one other point?
Sunan, I want all of you, by the way, to make points about how you would, what you would say to the EIP about this section, and what you would like to see in the London plan and/or in guidance.
I just want to make a point about the strategic housing market assessment, the SHMAR, which could be used to argue for tall buildings, because it talks about 1 and 2 bedrooms being 75% of all the housing demand. And I just think we need to be a bit careful about that, not only because of what Diana's just said, but because I don't think that one-person households or 2-person households doesn't necessarily mean 1 and 2 bedroom flats. Once you build 1 or 2 bedroom flats, it's very difficult to make them big again, whereas actually if you make units which are appropriate for families, they can also be good for co-living, and I think we should be encouraging innovation and design in a way that I think is a plan the place to encourage innovation and design. I think it is. I think it's not only the place to say what you mustn't do and what you can do. I think that there's a slight danger here that if you combine the plan with things like the SHMAR, bingo, you have a complete justification for tall buildings with 1 or 2 bedroom flats, and everybody says, what's wrong with that? I think what's wrong with that is that it is very limited, not very resilient. It doesn't really deal with change and flexibility, doesn't change with making mixed and diverse communities, all of which could be encouraged through more intelligent approach to how to house smaller households, not necessarily only by having 1 or 2 bedroom flats. So I just want to say that about SHMAR.
That's helpful. I mean, our next meeting is looking at the SHMA and at density, so we'll carry that point over. Tom, have you got any more to add?
I thought I did now, but it's gone out of my head. Sorry, it just sort of we've moved around quite a bit.
We have moved around.
And it's nearly past, so I have to go shortly.
I just want to find out whether people have got more to say about what should go in the London plan.
I feel that Londoners should have, and generally local residents should have a much greater say in the construction of tall buildings in existing areas, and whether they can have a veto. But I feel that at the moment they really have very little power, and it does affect enormously how you feel about an area if you have something on your doorstep. So
absolutely
I'd like
agree
to see
with that.
I agree with that. I would like to do it at a plan stage, not a development control stage. I think otherwise you get a chaotic, reactive, unstable system. I think that there should be, a level of engagement with local people which we simply have never achieved. But we need to do that in order to do really resilient and proper local plans. And the local plan could then tie back into this and have all the policies, if we correct it and all the way we've talked about today, add to it, then I think that is viable.
Chair, could I also add something? I mean, personally, from my experience in town Hamlets perspective, this tall building policy definitely could do with two additions. Firstly, where we talk about, and B, about the visual, function, environmental and cumulative impacts, and then it goes on to explain what they are. Under the functional sections, perhaps it would be better to incorporate the distinction between the kind of office tall buildings compared to residential and expand on that. And that could include how for example, if it is about family homes, rather than just setting out, or not only setting out that the lower levels are much more appropriate, but also encouraging people to think creatively about how those corridors work, how the design of those buildings could accommodate incidental spaces for these communities to come together.
Public realm,
For example, I live in a block of flats which is only 7 stories, but the corridor after my son was born is essentially the place he plays, because it's doorstep play, and we are on 3rd floor, so we can't necessarily always go down. That has actually enabled neighbors to actually know people. So I lived there for 5 years, but I didn't know my neighbors as much as since my son's birth. So there is clearly an opportunity for doorstep, which we don't explore. So I think the residential function should expand and explain that more. And going back to the cumulative impacts, again, not only looking at the impacts on amenity, etc. The cumulative impacts of actually how does community get formed? How do you make a piece of a city? That is where I think we should have in the policy to expand and say people should come together, prepare schemes in relationship to this, and particularly make reference to growth areas, because that is really the challenge where we are seeing the tall building projects. So there is a way that we can make the existing plans add more to help us to deliver schemes that are much more humane and more friendly to families and address those community issues.
Good. You also made a very nice point earlier about, it's an alarming point, but about the impact of clusters when they're residential, and what happened with the 18-metre spacing between them. And I think there's a clusters policy in the London plan, but we really, if we separate out tall buildings and have residential tall buildings and have some separate points made about them, then that would be one to include.
It would be very much so, because now that the NPPF and the direction of travel is, if you're living in Inner London Borough, amenity, sunlight, you don't have right to. So those are the kind of real issues. If we are going to create, these tall buildings are going to accelerate those issues even more. I think if we are able to capture that in the policy through the residential separation from the commercial, I think we can better inform, because we are going to have the hierarchy of this is the regional policy for London. And any inquiry or anything we deal with going through is going to really be helpful.
I know, Dinah, you've got other points, and you might write them in about how there's almost a generic tall building now because it's sold to the overseas market. every sort of foyer looks like a hotel foyer.
Yeah, and what Shree's describing is like it's really important that we need to talk about it. This idea of the actual doorstep play on the third floor, and if we are carpeting and these details are really fundamental to kind of working against that way of getting to know your neighbours.
Navin?
Chair, if the two borough representatives can write in with your situation in terms of capacity, because quite rightly Nikki has mentioned about London Plan being onerous, the new one, in terms of what is expected for the boroughs to deliver in terms of particularly high-rise buildings, etc. So whether you have the capacity, because given the sort of cuts and everything, planning departments are the worst ones when it comes to that. So given that scenario, you have that capacity, whether London Plan policies can reflect in terms of how the boroughs can be supported to have those effective policies and assessment of applications, etc. And indeed whether you're getting the right level of support, what additional level of support you would require, for example, from the GLA. Yeah.
Right. We're gonna have to close the meeting at this point. We're very happy to take any further points from you. So when you get the transcript and you look at what you said, if you want to add anything, we'd be really pleased to have it, because it all helps us with evidence. That's been a really interesting and helpful meeting. We have to note, don't we, Ozu?
Yes. Would you like me to read that out?
Yeah,
okay. Can I ask the Chair and Committee to note the reports and the discussions have taken place today, and to delegate authority to the Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chair to agree to use information from this meeting as part of the Committee's participation in the forthcoming London Plan examination in public.
That's noted. And then my final job is Ozu, who's been with us now for about 9 months and been absolutely superb committee clerk, is unfortunately leaving the authority. So we want to wish you very well for the future. We've really enjoyed all your work. So thank you. I think we should clap you. Okay. All right, that's the end of the meeting, and thank you all very much for your participation.
GLA, Committee Room 5.